What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Venom War, Venom Spider Man fighting Bedlam, zombie symbiotes, the whole 9 yards. So, before we get into the Spider Man and Bedlam fight, we do have to talk about Zombiotes for two reasons. One, because they referenced it in that comic, so we got to cover it ahead of time. And two, because this comic is amazing. It's everything I hoped it would be. So what goes on here is you pick up with a couple of Roxxon security guards, right? Transporting money, that kind of thing. And to kind of lead up to this, right? You guys can always check out the playlist at the end of the video if you need to get caught up. The long and short of it is that Alchemax was basically experimenting with symbiotes. The idea of potentially bonding symbiotes to like dead people in order to control them and make them do whatever it was they wanted to do. Ultimately, things went sideways and they ended up breaking out. And what this did is it just led to like zombie symbiotes overrunning the city of New York. So this whole thing is kind of gripped everybody, which is why one of these guys is sort of panicky. The other guy is just kind of like, it's whatever. We got to stop and get snacks, munch on delicious goodies. But the cool thing about this is they're kind of like, look, like we're in New York City, right? We have more superheroes than anybody else in the world. Yes, there's these kind of crazy zombie things going on out there, but it's not a great big huge deal. Only for one of these guys to basically get like snatched up, right? This guy Dougie or Doogie, I don't know how you would pronounce it, but nonetheless, he gets snatched up, right? Mac looks out the car and just sees like this guy being chewed on. And like Dougie's like, drive, Mac, just drive. And so this guy just starts hauling as fast as he can. At that point, we switch over to She-Hulk and Patsy Walker. And of course, She-Hulk being here, right? The day is saved, said no one ever, but it is kind of a cool thing, right? Patsy Walker is dope in this instance because for those of you guys who don't really follow Hellcat, it kind of makes sense. She's not an overly significant character, but she does have some cool stories. She's dope in this. And the reason why is because she's not following the traditional superhero role, which is to say, oh man, these people who are being bitten by these zombie symbiotes are being infected with like the symbiote virus and like they're becoming zombies essentially themselves, but they're alive in there so we can save them. She's like, nope, we're gonna kill every single one of these guys. And that's exactly what she starts doing. She starts killing everybody. Like literally, it's this like dad who's attacked and like his kids are watching on while it's happening. And like Patsy just like kills this dude and rips his head off. And where She-Hulk's like, what are you doing? The response of Patsy is like, no good sugarcoating the situation, Jennifer. Kids gotta learn. The world's a dark place and getting darker by the second. And so the question's like, what do we do in this situation? And literally, Patsy's just like, we follow the George A. Romero plan, right? Destroy the brain or remove the head. Of course, a great reference to Night of the Living Dead. But the fact is that like she just starts killing people and it's just like, wow, like She-Hulk doesn't really even know how to process all of this. She's like, this is not what we're supposed to be doing as superheroes. But much like Thanos snapping his fingers and dusting half the life in the universe, it's the smart thing to do here, right? Just take these guys out and call it a day because there's not really even any guarantee that like they can save these people from this symbiote virus they're infected with, because when they're attacked by these symbiotes, they're legitimately killed. And much like a traditional zombie virus, that the symbiote goo basically brings them back to life. So by all standards of measurement, this guy's dead. And so what ends up happening is that while She-Hulk's doing her thing, she turns around only to see that Patsy Walker is being attacked. At that point, we switch over to the last people you would expect to be a part of this, the Sinister Six. It's kind of amazing. I told you guys, it's really cool. You pick up with Shocker, right? Herman. And it's kind of this funny thing because the Sinister Six did go to war with Spider-Man in the Sinister War comic. I don't think we covered it. Maybe we did. I can't remember off the top of my head. It was a phenomenal story. Like, it was really cool. Boomerang gets killed, right? Like, one of the members of the Sinister Six dies. It's really, really awesome. But the cool thing here is that at the end of the day, the Sinister Six are by and large a criminal group. And like, they commit crimes. So in the midst of all this pandemonium, despite the fact that there's a few reservations here and there about whether or not they should be doing something with regards to this larger conflict, they're just kind of like, this is the perfect time to like rob folks, beat folks with bats and sticks, which is exactly what they start doing. They literally rob a money truck, or at least they try to knock this thing over. The problem is that like when this truck is attacked by the Shocker, who just, sends this thing flying, right, knocks it over, that like Overdrive, the guy who has the ability to like supercharge things, and really it's cool when he does it to cars because he makes them go faster, that when they get the vehicle open, like these zombie symbiotes immediately attack them. Right? Like they start going after these guys. And Shocker, of course, just like blasts the door open on this thing while Overdrive is fighting for his life. And then what ends up happening is Speed Demon, who's kind of like a less fast version of like Quicksilver, sees all of this and he's like, no, man, we're getting out of here, right? Like no score is worth any of this. And like he just bails. He tries to get out of there as fast as he can, only for him to be snatched up by one of the symbiotes and drugged back. Now again, he's nowhere near as fast as someone like Quicksilver. Honestly, I would say his speed is more on par with somebody like Captain America, right? But the fact is here, like this dude's snatched up and he's bitten by one of the symbiotes and ultimately turned. While that goes on, the Shocker just like grabs the case and bails. Like he's just like, I'm out of here, right? And just takes off with Overdrive. And so at that point, Overdrive literally jumps on the car, right? It looks like this old school Chevelle, which of course Shocker has just driven into the ground, driven it like a piece of crap, which he should never do with a car like that. And but ultimately ends up like supercharging this thing to help them get away from like Speed Demon. Now, the other thing here is that because of what happens, it's almost kind of perfect timing. She-Hulk gets knocked away at the same time they drive by, and she flies into the car and sends it smashing into a wall, which of course doesn't really like damage, Shocker or Overdrive or anybody like that. But it's kind of like, what do we do? Because things are about to go sideways because now we've got Speed Demon and Patsy Walker hot on our heels with an army of zombie symbiotes following them. Now here's the cool thing. There's another guy who's going to appear in this and is going to seize control of the zombie symbiotes, and it's not going to be the person that you think it is, right? It's really, really cool. And so at that point, we switch over to the Spider-Man versus Bedlam story. So what this does is this initially picks up at Alchemax headquarters. And again, just kind of a bit of a refresher because we never really covered it all that much. Alchemax is an organization that's been around in Marvel for a very, very long time. It's largely associated with Spider-Man. But the cool thing about it is that while they deal with all kinds of biological weapons and different things like that, they've largely been focusing on symbiotes in recent years, specifically after the events of King in Black. And even really before that, right? The idea of weaponizing symbiote matter and using it to create like super soldiers and different things like that, right? Agent Venom is a good example. But one of the things that happens is we end up finding out that Liz Allen, who's currently the CEO of Alchemax, is having a meeting with MERIDIUS. And so MERIDIUS being here reveals the fact that he's actually the one behind K42 and K43. That's the kind of substance that basically created Zombiotes in the first place. And in fact, one of the things that he does is he references Lee Price. Now, for those of you guys who don't know much about Lee Price, I think we have that video in the Venom playlist. If we don't, I'll add it to the playlist so that, I can kind of fill you in on everything. Lee Price was at one point a host for the Venom symbiote before Eddie Brock went back to being Venom and before we got the events of King in Black. He wasn't the most well received by fans. The story, I think, lasted something like 6 to 12 issues. It didn't last all that long. And then ultimately Eddie Brock returned. But it's cool that they kind of reference him because they talk about how he was essentially killed and was one of the first test subjects for like the zombiote virus. And so what happens is in this conversation between the two, Liz basically says, Mr. Meridius, was it? There's something very familiar about you, Meridius, a familiar breed of insanity. And so of course, in response to this, Meridius asked the question, don't you think symbiotes can be managed, Miss Allen? And the response of Liz is, oh, I know they can. Flash Thompson, the gold standard in symbiote management, is a close personal friend of mine, but you don't look like a Flash Thompson to me. Now, this is an important distinction because while we have seen that the Venom symbiote itself has kind of evolved over the years in Marvel Comics, that it's become more sentient and it's learned to understand morality, right and wrong, different things like that, it's not to say that all symbiotes do. Ideally, the symbiotes themselves do understand right and wrong. They initially turned against Null in the very early days of the Symbiote God's campaign against the universe before he was defeated by the Celestials. But the fact is, over the years, symbiotes have just kind of been out there doing their own thing. And so there's no reason to believe that every symbiote in existence understands morality. But when it comes to symbiotes like Toxin or Sleeper or something like that, they're all derivatives of Venom. So that whole moral compass kind of gets imposed on them in the same way that Venom itself has all the memories and knowledge of Peter Parker when it went to Eddie Brock way back in the days in David Michelini's Venom run. So the cool thing about this is that Liz kind of responds to this whole situation and says, you look like someone who mixed dead symbiote goo reanimated by a literal space vampire with toxic waste. It's the symbiotex all over again. Just tell me you haven't tested inflicted this on people. And the response of MERIDIUS is, relax, Miss Allen, I know exactly what I'm doing. Believe me, this is how to control the symbiotes once and for all. Now again, it is kind of an interesting quagmire here, because even when it came to someone like Flash Thompson as Agent Venom, being a host for the Venom symbiote and having one of the coolest story arcs in the history of Marvel Comics, the reality here was that Flash Thompson had his own moral compass, and there were times when he and the symbiote were at odds with each other. Whereas if you have symbiotes that are bonded to what are effectively corpses, corpses do not have their own moral compass. They're dead. Right and wrong, all that kind of stuff is completely irrelevant. It's just the symbiotes do whatever you tell them to. And so what happens is that in the middle of this meeting, a guy comes running in screaming about how like zombiotes have gotten out of the lab. There's even a zombiote horse, which sounds fantastic. I really hope we get that, but like they're running amok through the city of New York. And so what ends up happening is MERIDIUS takes one of the guys, Carlton Drake, and just like infects him with the zombiote virus, right? The newer version of the zombiote virus, not the one that's kind of infecting all those people who are running around out there in the city. It's a live human test subject. This dude immediately starts attacking everybody. Now, here's the kicker about this, and this is the thing that Liz Allen seemingly does not fully comprehend here. One of the things that we'll kind of revisit here in a second when we switch over to Eddie Brock and Spider-Man is the idea of MERIDIUS and Tyro and all those guys and how they specifically tie into Eddie Brock. But the long and short of this is that MERIDIUS can control symbiotes. So the question is, can he control the Zombiotes? And it looks like it. The reality here is that Carlton just kind of looks like a mindless monster just attacking everything. And because Liz Allen has a symbiote of her own in the form of Misery, it's something that MERIDIUS didn't necessarily plan for. He is able to like momentarily distract her and then just like punch her out of the building and just sort of send her flying down. But following the quote unquote ending of this meeting, Cletus Cassidy Carnage shows up. And that's not an encounter that we've had before. MERIDIUS, being as powerful as he is in relation to symbiotes, coming across Cletus Cassidy, right? Because one of the things to remember is leading up to this, Carnage traveled the multiverse and basically absorbed all these different powers and abilities of all these different Venoms and made himself immune to virtually every symbiote weakness that exists out there. The only symbiote that can defeat him in the here and now, as we mentioned before, is Anti-Venom, the symbiote specifically existing for the purpose of destroying other symbiotes, right? So what you end up doing is switching over to Peter alongside Bedlam and Eddie Brock. Now, it's kind of a little bit of an explanation here, and this is one of the things that we've explained before, so again, a little bit of the quick and dirty one. When Eddie Brock initially defeated Null the symbiote god at the end of the King in Black story, he went on to basically die, right? He goes into the afterlife, and then he encounters these different versions of himself. Bedlam is each version of Eddie Brock. It's best easier to understand if you look at them as like the stages of grief and learning about your own death. And so Bedlam just represents unbridled rage, right? The part of Eddie Brock that has no real remorse and is just a complete and total psychopath. But it also makes Bedlam incredibly powerful. Not only that, of course, as we saw in the previous video, that the main Venom symbiote itself was previously bonded to Dylan. At this point, it's bonded itself to Peter Parker because the symbiote doesn't trust itself with Eddie or Dylan, believing that it'll get them killed or something along those lines. And so what happens is with Spider-Man showing up here on the scene and basically re-encountering Eddie Brock with all the new powers that he has, which is to say he's effectively equal to MERIDIUS in terms of what he can do and potentially even more powerful, right? He can reconstitute himself from the dead, all that kind of good stuff. The Venom symbiote talks to Peter and it says, Peter, you should let me talk to him. I know Eddie. And the response of Peter is, yeah, but you're too close, Venom. I've got this. And that's what the Venom symbiote kind of muses to itself, right? It says, and I believe him, I am too close to Eddie and to his son, Dylan. I can't trust my instincts. I cannot trust myself. Let Peter explain. Let Peter have control. It's better that way. It's easier. So Peter says somebody had to put Venom on or he was going to die. And I figured you and Dylan might need him. But where Eddie extends it out and says, yes, that's great, right? I really need Venom. The response of Peter is, but here's the thing though, right? I've had your symbiote for a little while and we've come to an understanding. And from that place of understanding, I'm going to be honest here, pal, you do not look like a safe pair of hands. You're reckless. You would put him in danger. And he says, and I'm not sure Venom's so good for Dylan either. Venom sure didn't think so. And from what I overheard earlier, it's mutual. Here's my idea. You're worried about Dylan getting the symbiote, and he sure seems worried about you. So maybe the smart play is for me to keep him. A neutral third party. I'll rock the chains until you guys have worked things out. I mean, the chains are pretty cool. And they are pretty dope, right? Because like when we saw Spider-Man show up with the Venom symbiote in the previous video that we did, he literally came flying into this place like Spawn. It was amazing. It was one of the coolest things. And so ultimately, Eddie kind of gives ground, at least seems to. He says, like I said, you're right, Spider-Man. We should definitely stick to costume names. You want to be Venom? Then I'll be Bedlam. And so literally Eddie Brock absorbs the Venom symbiote onto himself. Now here's one of the kickers about what's going on here. Since the end of the traditional Venom run, which I guess is still kind of continuing technically as part of Venom War, there's been a lot of implication that Eddie Brock is becoming unhinged, right? Because one of the things to remember is that these different versions of Eddie, Bedlam, Tyro, so on and so forth, it's a progression, right? Eddie initially emerged out in the garden, right? The black garden of the symbiote matter. And then over time, as he learned about his own death and what was going on out there in the world, he was shifting through these stages of grief. One of those was Bedlam. And so in effect, because MERIDIUS is another stage of evolution, right? Not really acceptance per se, but if anything, like denial to his fate, right? The fact that he's going to become the eventuality, that Eddie Brock is becoming MERIDIUS. He's becoming psychotic. He's becoming crazy, right? He's becoming more corrupted by the power that he wields. And so that's why he really seems more like a villain than the hero that we've known for quite some time. And so when he dons the Bedlam symbiote, it enhances his abilities, right? Bedlam is stronger and faster than Venom traditionally is. And even the symbiote comments on this, right? It says, I know Eddie well. Even like this, I know him well enough to predict his moves. Call it symbiote sense. Combined with Peter's reflexes, it's poetry in motion. Every movement feels easy. So right. That doesn't mean I'm happy. I'm not enjoying fighting Eddie, but it is kind of nice to be rebonded to Peter. Because one of the things to know is that Peter hasn't fought Bedlam like this before, with like the Venom enhancements and so on and so forth. And I don't think Peter has actually fought Bedlam at all. He may have at some point, but the fact is, like, Peter is to a degree kind of in over his head, because what it does is it switches over to Dylan and his forces, which is basically Red Goblin, the grandson of Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, Toxin, who is quote unquote the son of Venom, if we want to look at it that way, and Flexo, who we haven't actually talked about before. The long and short of Flexo, it's not overly important in his history or anything like that. He is a symbiote that was basically transformed into kind of a robot. He's more of like a solid symbiote form, almost like a robot, as opposed to like organic and moving the way that you normally see symbiotes function. But it's also Sleeper here. Now, like I said, Sleeper is ridiculously capable, right? I mean, this is a symbiote that exists for the sole purpose of espionage. He's like a one-man Black Ops team, right? It's crazy how capable Sleeper is. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to Dylan, because one of the things to remember is the other half of this story is that Dylan was met by his future self. And seemingly in that future, the world has gone to pieces and has been taken over by Venom. Now, the kicker about all this and the way it seems to be going here, if I'm just speculating, is that in that future that adult Dylan comes from, that Eddie Brock regains the Venom symbiote and he goes insane just like MERIDIUS did. And he takes over the world and kills all the superheroes, replacing them with symbiotes in and of itself. So the fact is, we don't know exactly how things are transpiring, but it's Dylan who has part of the information trying to avoid some unguaranteed and nebulous future that he knows and that we know virtually nothing about. And so that's why Sleeper asks him, like, what do you want us to do, right? You're the one calling the shots here. You're the one trying to quote unquote prevent this dark future. What's the next move? Now for Spider-Man himself, right, while Dylan's sitting there trying to figure it out, Spider-Man going off against Bedlam is amazing. But in a lot of ways, his traditional tips and tricks don't work, right? Because one of the things that we learned in like Dan Slott's Renew Your Vows is that Spider-Man cracks jokes when he's fighting villains because it makes the villains think he's not taking the fight seriously. It doesn't work with Eddie Brock. Eddie Brock knows all of Spider-Man's moves. He knows that Spider-Man cracking jokes is designed to kind of throw him off guard. It doesn't work. Even when he tries to web him up, Eddie Brock just grabs the web chains and yanks Spider-Man down to the ground, right? So like like none of his traditional moves are working here. And so what happens is that Eddie, in control of Bedlam, wants to end this fight in the here and now and be done. Take the Venom symbiote back and launch whatever his campaign is, that he absorbs the last two versions of himself, right? So at this point, it's Eddie controlling Bedlam, and then there's just MERIDIUS out there. So as you guys can tell over the course of the story, it's Marvel slowly eliminating all these alternate versions of Eddie to the point where it's just Eddie himself, probably absorbing all these symbiotes and attaining an immense level of power. And that's exactly what happens here, right? He says, more fuel for the fire. And where Peter's like, did you just eat them? His response is, not anymore. They were weak. Now their mass makes us bigger, and their pain makes us stronger. Now the cool thing is the Venom symbiote notices and comments on the mood of Peter. And he says, Peter's anger bubbles and boils through me. I can feel it building. Or is it my anger that's building? And he's like, how much of this is my influence? I've rarely gone against my hosts. I do not take control of them, but from them, they are my direction. Now, there is no direction. We are out of control. I don't know what to do. Because one of the things that the Venom symbiote itself has been struggling with, and the reason why it didn't want to rebond to Dylan and why it's afraid of bonding to Eddie, given the fact that Eddie is slowly going insane, is that the Venom symbiote seemingly corrupts its host. It doesn't believe that it's inherently good or can be inherently good. It brings out the darker side of everybody that it bonds to. And so because of that, when it's bonded to Peter, that's the question, right? Is Peter legitimately angry because that's just how he feels? Or is he influenced by the symbiote and Peter's angry because the symbiote's angry? So it's a really, really cool question, right? A chicken and the egg type thing. And so watching all of this, right? Toxin just kind of comments, this is getting crazy, Dylan. We have to do something. Do we help Spider-Man or what? Talk to me, man. I know I said some stuff before, but I don't know what to do here. I admit it, okay? Even without a symbiote, you're our leader. And that's where Sleeper says, we'll all follow you, Dylan, to whatever end and give you whatever you want, whatever you need. And so Dylan finally steps up and says, Sleeper, Flexo, form on me. And they literally bond to him. And so what Dylan does is don what is quite possibly the most amazing Venom suit that I think I've ever seen, because this guy is huge and starts referring to himself as the Prince in Black. And so what this does is kind of a tail end here, is it switches back to MERIDIUS and to Carnage. And there's a kind of back and forth here, right? That again, MERIDIUS is just kind of hell-bent on power and almost corrupted by his abilities. And he's like, it looks like chaos, random events smashing into each other, no order, no pattern. But people like us know better, don't we? The random cruelty of the universe contains an implicit order, a beautiful design if you're high up enough to see it. The zombie symbiote plague is spreading fast. Soon, it'll be endemic, an unstoppable wave of symbiosis. And that's how I want everything. I want my garden without leaving this chair. And that's where Carnage responds and says Cletus would have called that boring. And where MERIDIUS doesn't realize that this is just the Carnage symbiote taking on the form of Cletus Cassidy, the response from Carnage is, it's a long story. But I think this version of you is just fascinating. And so that's where MERIDIUS is kind of like, after our last meeting, you'll forgive me for not being thrilled by that. What did bring you here exactly? Why now? What do you want? And that's where Carnage reveals the true plan that he has in mind. He says, oh, MERIDIUS, what does any good Satan figure want? The soul of Eddie Brock, gift wrapped. And seemingly Carnage has taken control of the Zombiotes themselves and will likely himself go to war against MERIDIUS and destroy him entirely. I'm kind of curious to see how this unfolds. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comments section. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.